price that Africa pays today on combating violent extremisms and armed conflicts, the price is too high that the monies that are involved are enough to provide hospitals, to provide clean water, to give basic education to our people. And so the question then is, why do we have to wait until we have a problem at hand and then can now commit enormous resources into combating things that ordinarily, if we had put a little of money in prevention, we wouldn't have to be confronted with the challenge today. And of course, the narratives of violent extremisms have been all suggested here, and as people have said, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel by reinforcing the strength of the socio-economic issues. They are very important as they are. And I think to some of the contradictions that come, is it poverty? And then some people are saying, no, it cannot be poverty because violent extremist groups are so rich enough to provide monies for recruitment. So poverty, in a sense, may not be. But in terms of recruiting foot soldiers, poverty is an issue, and that we cannot wish away. Now, like Peter was saying, the nexus between armed conflict and violent extremism is such that a study had come up to say that between 1989 and 2014, that more than 88% of all terrorist attacks occurred in countries that were experiencing or countries that are still involved or experiencing ongoing conflicts. And I'm happy he mentioned Nigeria, Pakistan, the 5 countries that he mentioned. No, but Nigeria is not actually experiencing civil war, no. Hypothetically, you find a lot of variables that have been reeled out. And some of the submissions would be like unchecked political associations, more or less, even when the chairman was making a presentation, sometimes the narrative tilts so much in the weight of religion. And I think that is one of the things that the violent extremists use to confuse us. I mean, I give you an instance in Nigeria. When Boko Haram started its attacks mostly against churches and Christians. And then people felt like, no, Boko Haram wanted to establish an Islamic caliphate and to wipe away Christians. That was the initial narrative. But today, we've come to the realization that more Muslims and mosques have been attacked and destroyed by Boko Haram than Christians and churches. And so what exactly is the mission? And so sometimes when we give the narratives of the religion, yes, they are very, very okay. Sometimes we also are carried away by issues of governance and whatever. But 2 things. Before we started, the chairman came and then FY came up and said, one of the things that we need to discuss. Now, a study that we had the opportunity to carry out by a colleague and commissioned by the West African Network for Peace Building, brought out some highlights that are often not talked about. And I think that will be my point of emphasis. What are these highlights? So I want to be self-opinionated, though deriving from the research that we conducted, for example, that very seldom do we talk about issues of international conspiracy in all of these things. So people are talking about bad governance in Africa, people are talking, but when you take the histories of African experiences, we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about imperialism, we're talking about the plundering of resources. Is there a grand design by some powerful nations there outside to, for example, destabilize African states in order to continue to have access to their resources? That is an information and a message that I don't get to hear in some of the gatherings that we have. It is enough for us to say that, yes, the young people don't have jobs. Yes, the young people will not have jobs. For example, it is said that every year, Africa needs to give 18 million jobs to its young people. Now, we don't have a commitment by the big nations to provide jobs for young people in Africa, but we have commitment to provide monies to combat terrorism. These are issues that I think that we have to, to confront. And until we're able to, and personally speaking, from that experience, now just to go direct, if you take the case of Mali, and that issue also came in Nigeria, and I'm happy, maybe the ambassador here, perhaps, that is in charge of the Lake Chad Basin from my own country, and I'm also happy that the general in charge of the multinational joint task force is also here. I mean, some of the narratives that we have, for example, is to say, even on the streets of Mali, you get to hear people say, the problem of terrorism in Mali is the problem of France. That the French, once you eliminate the French interest from Mali, and perhaps the Lake Chad region, we may be getting some solutions, like 50% of them. And I think that this is also the narrative that we should continue to propagate. So I would like to quickly go, go to the issues of dynamism. Now, yesterday at the presentation, some people were carried away by the fact that we said terrorism or violent extremism in Africa or in the world, in the global space, is a new phenomenon. It is not a new phenomenon. No. It has been with us for a long time. But it's just that we have not been taking lessons from what had happened. Of course, if we go back to the African space, we discover that some of this, at some point in time, ANC was declared a terrorist group, for example. I don't know who gave that definition. But we also have a group in Mozambique that was sponsored by America and Southern Africa, on decolonization issues. Now, again, we had the bombings in the 80s. We had the issue of the Lukabi bombing. And I think until when the 2001 terrorism took place in America, that was when terrorism became a new phenomenon. But that was not the case. We knew that, for example, the American state was behind the establishment of the Taliban groups to fight the Russians. Well, so, I mean, what is new about terrorism or violent extremism? There's nothing new to it. But somehow, because we are always carried away by the recent narratives, we think. But the dynamics of violent extremism, for me, is to look at it from the chameleon theory. The ability of violent extremist groups to infiltrate, adapt, mutate, and persist. Second, violent extremism today, it's like a chemistry of the HIV and AIDS. Yeah, that for me, it's like the chemistry of HIV and AIDS. Now, the chemistry of HIV and AIDS is such that, we're unable to provide cure because every second it mutates into a different kind of sickness. So when you are able to administer some medicines 2 seconds ago, it has transformed into something else. That is exactly what violent extremism is today. And the dynamics we have to interrogate is to ask from what constitutes VE groups and what is the mission of VE groups. We have not been able to define and to come to. Now, in terms of recruitment, there are basically 3 issues. There is the structuralist, there is the institutional, there is the ideological. Now, the structuralists are issues pertaining to poverty, inequality, unemployment, and all of those. Absence of strong institutions. Now, the institutional is that we'll be dealing with terrorist organizations that have the backings of some states. And so if you have violent extremism having the backings of some states, how do we deal with such problems? And the ideological, the global jihadist expansion and some of those things. Now, I don't really want to narrow my sense of understanding violent extremism to the point of just religion itself, I say. What is happening in Uganda, now same-sex are being annihilated and obliterated. That's a form of violent extremism. So perhaps, too, we could say xenophobia in South Africa is a form of violent extremism, and we have that issue to deal with here in Africa. Now, in terms of recruitment, yes, inducement, coercion, ideology, and all of those. Social exclusion, yes, very, very important. The internet, I'm sure that most of us will agree, that a lot of young people got recruited through the internet. But something struck us while we were having that field work. In Burkina Faso, for example, it was said that young people have been recruited into violent extremism by the violent extremist groups just for the purpose of having access to cell phones. Just cell phones. You know, prisons. Yesterday we talked about that. Now, I want to quickly go to the financing because it's part of what they've asked us to do. Now, money laundering. Of course, wherever you find violent extremist group, you are likely to find the presence of the transnational organized crimes. There's a nexus, a strong nexus. So, for example, with Boko Haram, money laundering, yes, human trafficking, arms trafficking, smuggling of drugs and narcotics, kidnapping, and of course we know, even when the Nigerian government gave a bait, or rather some money in exchange of the release of the Chibok girls, we had two groups of people in Nigeria. Some were saying, no, we're encouraging violent extremism. But was it not safer for us to give some bait to Boko Haram in order to have the release of those girls? I think it is. But Boko Haram had also used cattle rustling, and I'm sure the ambassador, cattle rustling and the control of markets, extortion, even to the highest level. This is not something that we often talk about. Extortion, not just for the of Boko Haram for the ordinary persons, but they have also been able to extort very high-level political elite in Nigeria in order to be able to finance their activities. The control of fishing activities, just recently it came, and logging of wood way to the Central African Republic, yes. Then the use of legitimate businesses, they've used that, especially sale of second-hand vehicles and some of those things. Fiefdom, and then commercial motorcycle operations. All of these have provided financing for Boko Haram. Now, counterterrorism efforts, so much had been, I want to take a dual-centric. No, it shouldn't be. You need strong seat to be able to provide human security for citizens. Now, because of that, I would take a dual position. You need the engagement of the military as much as you need the engagement of the soft approaches. And I think they should go concurrently. But one of the things that I also want us to take away, and I would be so happy if we take the Nigerian model, as emphasized yesterday. Why do we have to promote the Nigerian model? One, in Nigeria, among academics and amongst security personnel, we've come to the conclusion that if you allow the United Nations, that is just a narrative from academia, for example, if you allow the United Nations to step into your doors in the name of operations, then you are likely to go with those operations for the next 20, 30 years. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that instead of coming to combat, they're actually coming to complicate the issues. That is the position that we think. And I think that is why we would have to, in a sense, promote the homegrown solutions. The homegrown solutions. But even our national governments have distanced themselves from the homegrown solution. One of the very high traditional rulers that we interacted with in Nigeria had said to us, for example, Boko Haram wouldn't have gone beyond 3 months in Nigeria if only the Nigerian state had engaged the traditional institutions. We saw it as something that the government can do alone and neglected those community institutions that were necessary in combating some of these issues. Again, because there is a total absence of local governance in Nigeria, gave Boko Haram the opportunity to excel. So, what am I saying? Yes, I'll conclude now. What am I saying? That we had an experience in the ECOMOG, for example, that was very successful and was very applauded. But I want to say that in Nigeria, as some of us would say, that Nigeria had not actually been deservedly recognized for the role it has played in ECOMOG, for example. So what do we have now today? We have an alliance that people are saying the United Nations, the British, but we exported what we didn't have at the time. We say Nigeria exported democracy to Sierra Leone and was importing fuel that we had. So I think we would have to go back and look at our societies, because any solution that's going to be provided, even by the United Nations, if it is not in consultation with the local people, would be a solution not for the people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.